I think the room is full, so that's a good reason to start. I'm Dan Brock, the director of the Division of Medical Ethics, and one of the most pleasant things I have to do each year is to introduce the Gay Lecture. And that's a special pleasure for obvious reasons this year. The George W. Gay Lecture, as your program tells you, is the oldest endowed lectureship at Harvard Medical School. The program says quite possibly the oldest medical ethics lectureship in the U.S. I think quite possibly is probably can be removed. I think it is the oldest medical ethics lectureship. In 1917, it only took a gift of $1,000 from George Gay to establish this lectureship. I assume it's grown a bit since then. And it's been given by an extraordinarily impressive group of speakers, including Erich Fromm, Felix Frankfurter, Margaret Mead, Elizabeth Kübler-Ross, E.O. Wilson, Joshua Lederberg, Elie Wiesel, Marian, Wright, Edelman, and Dame Cicely Saunders. And today's lecturer joins that distinguished group with just as much distinction. Paul is probably well known to most of you. He's a medical anthropologist and a physician, founding director of Partners in Health, which is an international charity organization located here in Boston, but operating in several sites around the world. It provides both direct healthcare services and undertakes research and advocacy activities for those who are sick and living in poverty. His work draws on his clinical work, his clinical practice at the Brigham, where he was an attending physician in infectious disease and chief of the Division of Social Medicine and Health Inequalities. And he's medical director of the charity hospital in Haiti as well. Along with colleagues, he's pioneered novel community-based treatment strategies for AIDS and tuberculosis, including drug-resistant TB. And his colleagues, and this is, I think, especially important as I view Paul's accomplishments, he and his colleagues have successfully challenged what had been the conventional wisdom among policymakers and other critics that quality health care couldn't be delivered in resource-poor settings. And Paul has shown that that view was false. He's also written extensively about health and health inequalities, social inequalities, and human rights. His most recent publication, his most recent book, rather, is Pathologies of Power, which was published by University of California Press in 2003. He's the recipient of many awards, including the Duke University Humanitarian Award from the school from which he graduated as an undergraduate, the Margaret Mead Award from the American Anthropological Association, the American Medical Association's Outstanding International Physician Award, and the Heinz Humanitarian Award. And in 1993, he received what have come to be known from the MacArthur Foundation as the Genius Awards, the Genius Fellowships. He also, as probably many of you know, is the subject of Tracy Kidder's book, Mountains Beyond Mountains, The Quest of Dr. Paul Farmer, A Man Who Would Cure the World, which was published by Random House in 2003. And if you haven't read it, I recommend it. More generally and more personally, I think of Paul as a man who recognizes social injustice for what it is, but isn't willing to tolerate it or to say we can't do anything about it. Instead, he works tirelessly to address and remove social injustice as he sees it. And he served as a role model for many students, many physicians, and others, a role model and an inspiration to what living an ethically committed life can be and what one can do living such a life. So I can think of no one who better fits the ideals of the Gay Lectureship than Paul Farmer, and it's my honor and pleasure to introduce him.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Not bad for an ethics conference turnout. And there are rules to the game of giving these endowed lectureship. You're supposed to write out your talk. I think that's a big part of the rules of the game. And I did. Here it is. And I would like to do my best to not just read it, though. And so I will skip over parts, and I would happily make it available to anybody who'd like a copy of it. But the rules of the game in ethics and in philosophy, moral philosophy in particular. I'm sure that you all read moral philosophy every night before going to bed, because yes, instead of 10 milligrams of Ambien, it's really the equivalent of about 15 milligrams of Ambien. I've found in double-blinded controlled studies. And I've been reading a lot of it, and I thought that I would start in typical fashion as a moral philosopher, and start with a hypothetical scenario. Shall we? So let's say that we're in a first world medical school. Let's add, merely for the sake of argument, of course, that it's a very large medical school in the northeast of the United States. In fact, the world's largest medical school in terms of wealth and prestige. Pronouncements from its faculty have considerable weight. Allow me to proceed as if I myself were on the faculty of said medical school, and perhaps even to round out the argument, an alumnus who has been for years able to move between a city in the Northeast and, say, a small and very poor island nation, one hard by the United States, one with an AIDS problem. Let's pretend it's Haiti, but just for the sake of argument, of course. Now, as a grateful member of the university community, I would want to be of service, especially to students and the next generation of students, and one way to do that would be to serve on what's termed the International Committee, which oversees student research and training abroad. Now let's say that it's the year 2000, and an increasing fraction of medical students are interested in studying in Africa and in working on AIDS, the world's leading infectious cause of adult death. To further complicate the situation, imagine that students and some faculty members were pushing for consensus regarding the necessity of AIDS treatment in African settings, or in Haiti, where the university had at the time research and training partners. Imagine that this support would later come to pass, but was not forthcoming initially, in part because treatment with antiretrovirals, or ARVs, was deemed not cost-effective in poor societies. Now, I'm not going to do what academics do and make little quotation marks every time I mean to say cost-effective. Although I have a friend who's a neon artist, if you can imagine, who said he was going to make me these little things that would light up whenever I wanted to do this. So I have quotation marks in here around both cost-effective and societies, and I'll return to that. But let's say, just to continue our hypothetical scenario, that it was very difficult at that time to get faculty to agree with the proposition that it would be feasible to treat AIDS in Africa, and that the university continued to send students off to that continent to participate in research on AIDS. Thus, the students ended up, in this hypothetical scenario, of course, in African research settings in which no therapy was available to patients with AIDS. However, when the students received funding from this hypothetical international committee to do research projects on AIDS in Africa, they were sent off to Africa with 28 days of a 3-drug regimen of ARVs themselves on the off chance that they might somehow be exposed to HIV. And that's how I'd like to lay out, in the fashion of a moral philosopher, the kind of ethical dilemma that I'd like to discuss today. Now, here are some of the ethical questions that would arise. What obligation do those noted above, students and researchers and faculty have, what obligation do they have to insist that the African patients in question receive proper therapy? How are cost and effectiveness the key words of the regnant paradigm in what's now termed global health? How are they calculated? And I have to thank Dan Brock for his terrific work, his critical work on the topic of cost-effective analysis and how it's used today. Are the students, researchers, and African non-patients really from different societies? How do ethical dilemmas so described fit into a broader human rights framework? These are the sorts of problems I'd like to describe and the sort of questions I hope to address today. I suspect that certain ethicists, how many of you here are ethicists, by the way? So here I am, like, making all this effort for two people. I knew it. It's Dan and Dan. You have to be named Dan to get a job in ethics at Harvard, I'm suspecting. Yeah, I told you I should have brought slides. Whether you're writing from some kid came up to me at Duke last week. They were launching the Global Health Institute. Some kid came up to me and said, "I just want to know, Dr. Farmer." And I said, "Yes." He said, "I just want to know if you're writing from a Kantian or a utilitarianist perspective." And only ethicists ask those kind of questions. Anyway, whether you're writing from a utilitarian or Kantian or Rawlsian, the first time I heard the term Rawls, by the way, someone said, "Well, what do you think of Rawls?" And I said, "What, Lou Rawls?" So me doing this talk was a bit of a stretch. Actually, I'm told that Lou Rawls was quite a philosopher as well. But anyway, I suspect that if you were an ethicist, in the odd event you were an ethicist, you might think about this dilemma that I described, this hypothetical dilemma, in terms of what is called in the literature the moral significance of distance. And I'd like to spend some time picking apart that notion as fraudulent. Now, in this emerging literature, the African non-patients, some of them research subjects, would be termed the distant needy. Let me just read from a recently published book on this topic so that you can see the terms of the debate. Quotation, "If we have duties and obligations towards each other in everyday moral context, should these duties be extended to the needy? If so, what should the nature and role of institutions implementing such duties beyond our own borders of special ties and communities?" Though moral philosophers have pondered these questions in the past, such issues have become the focus of especially intense debate. Now, the philosopher's awareness of the distant needy is, of course, most welcome, just as the medical students' ARVs would have been welcome. But the notion of the moral significance of distance generates more questions than it answers. Would our neighbors in equally poor Haiti be classed as the distant needy, or are they the nearby needy? What if we're speaking of Haitians or Africans or Dominicans working to keep our universities sparkling? Haitians who live right around the corner from here. Are they suddenly members of a new society upon immigrating? Also, what sparked this especially intense debate, and what are its contours? Philosopher Dean Chatterjee, the editor of a volume entitled The Ethics of Distance, offers one common explanation for a growing interest in theories of justice that see beyond the boundaries of a single nation state. And I'm quoting again. "Today we live in a world in which spheres of interactions are constantly expanding, while advanced technology makes it easy to reach the distant needy and vividly broadcast their plight to all. In parallel with the growth of these global relationships, there has been an enormous increase in ethicists' interest in questions regarding the morality of affluence in a world of poverty and the individual's responses to it. In addition to creating new perspectives on individual moral obligation, this discussion is transforming political philosophy. While the initial fluorescence of interest in theories of justice began with John Rawls, not Lou Rawls, John Rawls' A Theory of Justice, solely concerned relationships among fellow citizens, theorists of social justice now frequently attend to issues of global inequality and institutional responses to it." End quote. Many, within ethics and without, have offered reason for worry about foundational and normative accounts when they are not linked closely to social analysis. If a 19th century French philosopher were to think of the plight of the poor in Haiti as a question of the moral significance of distance, we would immediately argue that he was obscuring historical reality, eliding the fact that his own country created Haiti as a slave colony. Knowledge of the slave trade and related colonial practices would lend necessary context, pointing to the moral significance of proximity, not distance. Only a firm attempt to desocialize our understanding of Haiti and France would lead us to underline distance and happenstance rather than proximity, causality, connection. My remarks today are largely about the process of desocialization. I just looked at the clock because I want to make sure that there's plenty of time for discussion. I'd like to extend this argument leveled in discussing a hypothetical French philosopher or a hypothetical medical school in the northeast of the United States. Of course, that wasn't really a hypothetical medical school. The rest of it was hypothetical. But notions of proximity and distance are not merely social constructs, but they are still social constructs. And many discussions of distributed justice across national boundaries reveal a marked naivete about how political economies work now and about how our current social inequalities came to be. It's history and other socializing disciplines that show us that. Despite talk of recent globalization, we have long lived in a world in which it would be possible, for example, for Haiti to furnish 2/3 of all pre-revolutionary France's tropical produce, or for a Haitian housekeeper to tend to our teaching hospitals. It's a world in which a Ghanaian-born student at HMS might return to Ghana to do a summer of sponsored research on the brain drain affecting the country of her birth. A world in which recent events and processes are speeding or slowing the emergence and retrenchment of social inequalities almost invisible to some who easily traverse national boundaries, while the same social pathologies are glaring to others who share, however briefly, the same social field. It's a world in which HIV and other pathogens spread readily across such boundaries, while the fruits of science, including treatments, are stuck in customs. A world in which even discussion of distributive justice erases our historically forged connections with some of the poorest people in the world, rendering any honest accounting of justice impossible, allowing some to appear generous and others merely needy. It will be my thesis here that we need more attention, not less, to theories of justice, but we need these discussions to be grounded in a sound knowledge of social history, social process, social connection. In preparing for this talk, I turned, as I said, to some of the recent literature about theories of justice. For example, the previously cited volume, which was published only a couple of years ago, claims to draw on nearly all of the leading figures in recent debates on transnational non-interventionist assistance. And I can well believe it. But although Peter Singer notes that when he first read A Theory of Justice, he was astonished that a book of nearly 600 pages with that title could fail to tackle the injustice of unequal wealth between different societies, only one philosopher among a baker's dozen really bothers with a critique of his peers regarding their lack of understanding of the history of transnational resource flows. Philosopher and political scientist Thomas Pogge, did I say that right, Dan? Extends Singer's claim, turning it into something of a rebuke based on a deeper knowledge about the facts of our world. And listen to Pogge. He says, by seeing the problem of poverty merely in terms of assistance, we overlook that our enormous economic advantage is deeply tainted by how it was accumulated over the course of one historical process that has devastated the societies and cultures of 4 continents. One historical process. Pogge is, in my view, on precisely the right track here. If we want to discuss our obligations to the distant needy, we need first an honest discussion about how our world got to be the way it is today and where it is going. For it's a shared principle in many discussions of justice that if we've done harm to someone, we have special obligations to that person who is more our victim and less our needy but distant citizen of another society. When I was asked to give this lecture, I thought first of my own shortcomings in the arena of moral philosophy. I already told you about the mistake of thinking of Lou Rawls rather than John Rawls. But then I thought about all that I had learned from the Haitians I've had the privilege to know, or from Mayans in Mexico or Guatemala, or from Rwandans. And trust me, our patients would not agree with philosophers or ethicists or others who look upon the current difficulties in Haiti or Guatemala or Rwanda and see distance rather than proximity. Linking social analysis to moral reasoning is a time-honored way of exploring ethical dilemmas, and here I'm going to focus on my experience working as a physician in Haiti, in Rwanda, and parts of the city that aren't even a mile from here. This is not international comparison, or even, to use a term I misused in some of my earlier writings, a transnational one. It is a translocal analysis, certainly, but geography is not at the heart of the matter so much as social disparities are. Although there are many types of social disparity, I'll surprise no one here by paying particular attention to 21st century poverty. Now, to put this in scholarly terms, poverty is always about the Benjamins. But 21st century poverty is about things like access to ARVs or electronic medical records, to the fruits of science and technological progress in general. If we can agree that we and most people who have the privilege of working in a university like this one are squarely within the confines of the rich world, we can certainly find the poor world and the worlds of the poor all around us. Although much work in social sciences relevant to medicine now studies up social gradients, most work, and certainly my own, is conducted in settings of great poverty. Sometimes these are settings of truly extreme poverty where the major struggle every day is against hunger and violence and disease. Sometimes there are settings of relative poverty where the struggle is against racism, gender inequality, or the lack of basic social entitlements such as medical insurance or affordable housing. Contemporary ethical problems are rooted in these disparities as much as violence and terrorism are. So too, I'll argue here, are all of the major contemporary human rights struggles. So my lecture will proceed with 4 basic theses. First, that social inequalities, both local and translocal, can be measured but often are not, and that we still lack the metrics necessary to describe the social cost of inequalities. Second, that these inequalities are not only a source themselves of many ethical dilemmas, but also constitute in and of themselves our chief, if often unexamined, ethical dilemma. The outcome gap and the survival gap, for example, life expectancies that rise in some places even as they fall in others, also constitute our most pressing human rights problem. Third, that desocialization, and I'm sorry to use such a nerdy word, but it's the right one, I think, that desocialization of translocal ethical dilemmas is not only a serious epistemological problem, but one that further compounds the ethical and human rights dilemmas discussed here. Fourth, and finally, that the engagement of rich world universities in poor world research poses ethical problems quite distinct from those identified by institutional review boards. Some of these ethical problems are related to our understanding of what we, as members of universities, owe the destitute sick. I'd like to examine each of these theses in turn and conclude with some of the challenges faced by all those who venture forth from the university to examine directly the persistent problems of violence, distress, disease, and the rights violations they so often come to constitute. So, first, just to repeat it, social inequalities can be measured, but we lack the metrics necessary to do so. There's a brisk debate these days about social inequalities, how to measure them, and whether or not they're growing or shrinking. On the growing or shrinking front, allow me to quote the economist James K. Galbraith, who reviewed this topic a few years ago for Daedalus. So what are the facts, he asks? Has globalization hurt or helped? Oddly, researchers do not know. Mostly, they do not ask, end quote. Galbraith steers those interested in secular trends to inequality in manufacturing pay. And again, this is another thing I try to review every night before going to bed, inequality in manufacturing pay. And I'm sure you do as well, but I'm going to go ahead and tell you what he learned anyway. You're supposed to laugh when I make these jokes, so. I mean, my palms are already sweating. This is in the years prior to 1998, which is the last year for which he had data. When the global trend is isolated, he writes, we find that in the past 2 decades, inequality has increased throughout the world in a pattern that cuts across the effect of national income changes. During the decades that happened to coincide with the rise of neoliberal ideology. And again, just to interrupt for a second, I have to say, 10 years ago, when I first started hearing about neoliberal economic ideology, I said to my coworkers at Partners in Health, including Jim Kim, I said, do we have to learn this stuff? It's really boring. But we really did have to learn this stuff. And our country is not only the engine of much of this neoliberal economic theory, it's being turned towards our own populations as well. So I hope, again, in the question and answer session that we'll have a chance to talk about this. Anyway, I'm going to use a little bit more of his jargon. During the decades that happened to coincide with the rise of neoliberal ideology, with the breakdown of national sovereignties, and with the end of Keynesian policies in the global debt crisis of the early 1980s, inequality rose worldwide. End quote. Now, this is important stuff. I think everyone can agree. And there's lots of debate on this topic. And even the terms of the debate are contested, terms like Keynesian or neoliberal. We're not going to do that because it's not all that interesting. The basic outlines of the debate are thus. Some argue that all boats are being lifted. Others say that no, some boats are being lifted and others are left to founder. And some have argued in still more Victorian fashion that inequality is good and spurs growth. Now, this is true. They really do argue this. Now, because their arguments are usually more polemic than based on empiric data, but it really is hard to argue with Galbraith's basic conclusions that social inequalities are growing globally. And in his most recent, just to give an example, many of you here will have read Jeff Sachs's recent book, The End of Poverty, which I think is a really good book to read. He is not among those who criticizes globalization. Again, this is another contested term, of course. He's someone who favors a lot more trade, but he also lays out the rise in translocal international inequalities. Now, how is this happening? Well, a lot of it has to do with trade agreements, not just trade. And I'm going to return in closing to the university and trade agreements, which is thin ice for me because I don't know that much about it. In fact, to prepare for this, yesterday a couple of undergraduates who I hope are here helped me prepare this. Trade agreements are crafted by the powerful, of course, and they've long been unfair to the poorer partners. And again, I'm going to cite this fellow, Thomas Pogge, again. He reviews data regarding secular trends in global inequality, noting that the income gap between the world's 20% richest 20% and poorest 20% went from 1 to 30 in 1960 to 1 to 60 in 1990 to 1 to 74 in 1997. And I'm sure it has continued to pace since 1997. And he asks, and here's the moral philosopher speaking again, if the global economic order plays a major role in the persistence of severe poverty worldwide, and if our governments acting in our name are prominently involved in shaping and upholding this order, then the deprivation of the distant needy may well engage not merely positive duties to assist, but also more stringent negative duties not to harm. The cause of increased inequalities are not the only point, nor are their dimensions or temporal trends. Injustice and unfairness are themselves the point. And Amartya Sen argues, he just wrote a book last month. I make it sound like I read all these books, but in fact, I usually do not, much preferring to read People magazine. But I did, Amartya Sen gave me the book, and so I figured the least I could do would read it. And it's very good. It's called Identity and Violence. My brother Jeff, who is a pro wrestler, made the mistake of going to the bookstore at the university and buying another big giant fat book of Amartya Sen's, which to my delight was full of mathematical equations. At least you got him to sign it. This is Amartya Sen. Even if the poor who are engaged in the globalized economy were becoming just a little richer, this need not imply that the poor are getting a fair share of the benefits of economic interrelations and of its vast potential. Nor is it adequate to ask whether international inequality is getting marginally larger or smaller. That's just what I just asked, but it's not enough, he says. To rebel against the appalling poverty and staggering inequalities that characterize the contemporary world, or to protest against the unfair sharing of the benefits of global cooperation, it is not necessary to claim that the inequality not only is terribly large, but is also getting marginally larger. So what about metrics? Several people in this room, including the Dans, Wickler, and Brock, have shown us just what we don't know in seeking to measure health equity. In the first of 9 questions posed about metrics, Dan Brock asked how states of health and disability should be evaluated. In 1980, in his Tanner lectures, Amartya Sen was asking simply enough, equality of what? When we hear the word cost, we think of cost in dollars or pounds or euros, or gourds for us Haitians, right? But for anyone interested in understanding cost, we have to broaden our analysis substantially, since inequality becomes embodied in various ways. Again, this is the way some anthropologists look at this, is the embodiment of social inequalities. Now, there's a huge literature on this, and many in this room will know more about it than I do. Although I did try to review this in the late 90s for a book on social inequalities and infectious disease. For example, you'd want to read Michael Marmot, who in the 1970s published a series of papers along with his colleagues suggesting that the health of populations was related not only in linear fashion to measures such as GDP, but also to indices of social inequality within, again, the term used is often societies. They really mean countries when they say societies, or nation states, which after all are very recent creations. Not Haiti, which is older than many, but when you think about some of the places mentioned, these are really fairly recent creations. Specifically, Marmot and co-workers examined mortality among those of different employment grades in the British civil service. Now that, to me, being in the British civil service would be reason enough to die as soon as is possible, but we'll leave that aside. Whether death was due to coronary artery disease or to most other measures of mortality in the series, those lower in this entirely middle-class totem pole. These are not poor people. These are people with jobs and in the British civil service. Those lower in that middle-class totem pole fared much worse than those higher. And then this looks to be getting worse. Citing a paper, some work published in 1996, Marmot wrote very recently, both for ischemic heart disease and suicide, the social gradient became considerably steeper over the past 20 years. Now, this line of inquiry was taken up by Richard Wilkinson, who in 1996 published a book called Unhealthy Societies, The Afflictions of Inequality. In it, he used associations between indices of social inequality and health outcomes, such as life expectancy at birth, to argue that unequal societies, like ours, for example, are noxious to health in ways that are poorly understood. This and similar arguments, using data from more affluent nations, have spawned what is now a cottage industry exploring such concepts as social capital. And some of the research has been conducted by colleagues next door at the School of Public Health. People like Ichiro Kawachi, Norm Daniels, Bruce Kennedy, who've come to argue that justice is good for our health based on some of these associations. Now, I've already been complaining a little bit about the conflation between the term society and nation. Every time we deepen our understanding of social process, administrative and political boundaries become blurred. Something that might reasonably be called a global society emerges. Now, I don't care what we call it, but there is something that could be described in that way. For example, universities are part of it. I'm part of it. Students who can find $2,000 for a summer research project, they're part of it, you're part of it, rather. A lot of us in this room are part of that, whatever it is. And it's a dizzyingly unequal space. And as anyone making the short trip from Harvard to Haiti can tell you, in this world, proximity and not distance is king. Connection, not disjuncture, is important. And this is the world in which we need to learn how to calculate the cost of global inequality. As the rich grow richer, as the poor fail to grow richer, as the world grows smaller, what sort of costs might we expect? Some of us think about the social cost of inequalities, and I have to admit, many of us, especially anthropologists, subsume pretty much everything under the term social. I mean, economic for us is part of social. But it's a helpful concept, the notion of social cost, as opposed to, I was shocked. I went to a conference once in Vancouver, a tuberculosis conference, and I sat down. I'm sure, again, you guys always go to these conferences yourself, just like every week when you're reading the pay grade inequality outcome differences. And I sat down next to a physician economist from Harvard, and I won't name him, but his first name's Chris. And he and I were training together. And they were showing some, this is a tuberculosis meeting, and they were showing some slides. And up on the screen were lots of equations and other things that I didn't understand. You're going to enjoy that book. You made the mistake of getting. And I saw the term WTP. And of course, I started thinking about all the things that might mean. I thought back to my rich childhood heritage, where WT meant something very clear. And I said to Chris finally, what's that mean? And he said, it means willingness to pay. And I assumed that there was some complex, equation and square roots of this and that and, various cosine. I assumed there was some complex equation that gave us WTP, willing to pay. And I said, well, how's that calculated? Which is usually a mistake around economists. Don't do that. But all he said was, well, it's just based on GDP. And I said, you're kidding. So willingness to pay is based only on GDP? So the poorer you are, the less willing you are to pay. Now, and a social scientist would say, well, that's crazy. That's not about willingness to pay. That's about ability to pay. And if you want to use jargon, why don't you talk about agency and constraint, about the ability to make choices and the ways in which we're constrained by poverty, racism, gender inequality, and the sorts of social inequalities that are being discussed here today. Those are the kinds of questions I think we need to be asking, including in medical ethics. And I think, again, this is a division that is very welcoming of these resocializing efforts. But in most of the ethics literature, the term society is just a gloss for nation state, and then you have things like willingness to pay or other metrics that are based exclusively on the GDP of the country in question, which again is an astoundingly crude measure, it seems to me, if it's a dismal science, they ought to at least get along with it and get better equations. Anyway, this way of seeing social pathologies is not the right one, because what occurs within the borders of a nation are not necessarily the only things we want to look about. And again, anybody who studies epidemic disease knows this, because these are invariably translocal and transnational epidemics. It's connections to other places and other times that we need to understand, and these can't be hidden away, as in the hypothetical example of a French philosopher who worries about the distant needy in Haiti. What happens when we insist that both the local and the translocal, the regional and the global, are part of the question, and the rich world and the poor world are, of course, both part of a single world. Now, how visible, here's a way a social scientist might put this. How visible translocal social inequalities are and how noxious or costly they're seen to be is related to one's relative position in hierarchical social networks. And working in Haiti has been really wonderful because there are endless proverbs. Some of my friends from Haiti are here today. There are just endless proverbs about this, that if you're poor, you can't afford not to notice, and it's only the wealthy who can pretend not to notice these kinds of things. And I'd wager that that's correct, and that with changes in telecommunications, our comfort and excess is more readily visible to the world's poor than their suffering is to us. Although I have to say, I had a bizarre experience this summer, leaving, as I did, New Orleans 4 days before Katrina, and going from New Orleans to Rwanda. That is not a direct flight, by the way. And so I saw the spectacle of our own discomfort in Rwanda, where we had a high-speed internet connection in the hospital where we work, and everybody was saying, this is happening in your country? I can't believe it. That maybe we can talk about that during the question and answer session. But really, it's often a one-way mirror where the poor see all of this spectacle of affluence and opulence, and we're not seeing, true, there is more of it, as Dean Chatterjee argued in launching that book on the morality of distance. We're seeing more of it now. And certainly here at Harvard, the students are so engaged in this work now compared to when I was a student here. But it's still something of a one-way mirror where our opulence is quite visible to the world's poor, and we have a long way to go just to be able to see the same things that they see. Social inequalities are visible across great distances, and conspicuous consumption in the face of famine and disease may lead to resentments of which we are only dimly aware. Now, resentment born of indignities is difficult to measure, but it's nonetheless real. And this is 2,000 years before Rousseau. Here you have to, in a philosophy talk, you have to quote poetry. Actually, Amartya Sen does it, so I might as well give it a try. This is from the Greek lyric poet Alcaeus, 6th century BC. He says, the worst of ills and hardest to endure, past hope, past cure, is penury, who with her sister mate, disorder, soon brings down the lofty estate and makes it desolate. And the link between inequality and violence is the subject of a large and growing literature. And this is what I do my work on these days. I'm not going to discuss this much here today unless we discuss it in our question and answer session, but I will return to this if we have time in thinking a little bit about Rwanda and Haiti. So that was part one. Don't worry, I'm going to speed it up. I'll finish by 5 so that we can talk. Part one was to say social inequalities are growing. Part two is to say, and we don't have good metrics for them. Part two is to say social inequalities constitute themselves a source of many, and I would almost say most of the ethical dilemmas that we discussed. On the way in here, someone gave me some materials about organ transplantation in China, criminally advanced organ transplantation among people who basically had prisoners. I haven't read it yet, but you've heard about this. So again, there's a story that is in the medical ethics literature, organ transplantation. What I've been talking about so far is not really often in the medical literature, as my colleagues, the Dans, would agree. But here's something that is in the medical literature, and the focus is not very often on, when we talk about the ethics of organ transplantation or xenotransplantation, the focus is not on access and whose organ goes into whom as much as it might be in the eyes of an anthropologist, for example. I have a couple of friends and colleagues who work on the same topic as anthropologists, and they focus largely on the question of social inequalities in organ transplantation. Anyway, when we look at the literature on research ethics, organ transplantation, brain death, xenotransplantation, the staple and the quandary ethics of the individual in an ICU. I've been on the ethics service at the Brigham, for example, and enjoyed it very much. What an ethics service is an ethics team. So you're called in. You can actually be called by a nurse or a family or a physician. And it's a small group of people, pretty serious, who meet and respond to serious ethical problems. And most of the time, they occur in an ICU. But almost every experience I had, there was somehow related to inequalities of one sort or another. These are the quandary ethics of the individual. They are rooted in these large-scale social inequalities I'm talking about, but that's not what they want us to talk about in our ethics consult. We literally leave a consult sheet, like if you were an infectious disease specialist or a surgeon who is consulting on a medicine patient, you leave a consult note. We'd leave these consult notes, and trust me, they did not want us to go off on some long discussion of how racism was complicating the experience of this family, and yet we knew that it was. So this is the kind of desocialization that I'm admitting that we did in our efforts to be of use to both patients and staff. That's the quandary ethics of the individual. Now, many people are spared all of these ethical dilemmas because they never get a chance to be patients at all. Remember the African non-patient who was able to be a research subject in a hypothetical research project, but was not a patient. So the ethical dilemmas of being a patient are unknown, or were unknown. And I'm not saying that the access to care is the only important thing. As many people in this field have noted, I'm looking at a quotation from Fabienne Peter, who used to be here. She wrote, "Access to health care is only one social factor among others that influences people's health. But social inequalities do determine, by and large, who has access to care and who does not. And this is especially true wherever health care is a commodity rather than a right." And again, I'd like to return to the rights-based framework in closing. So my argument, part two, is that persistent poverty and inequality are at the root of many ethical dilemmas and are also themselves a huge ethical and human rights dilemma. And in arguing this, we get to move medical ethics, and I believe this is why the committee invited me to give this talk, is because they knew that I would try to move ethics discourse towards a rights framework, but also to re-socialize both the rights framework and ethics discourse. Now, what I've been doing in my writing, in which Dan was good enough to mention in the introduction, although I suppose that is your job, right, to do that. I've been trying to apply rights language to the problem of who has access to what. Now, Wright's language, like moral and ethical reasoning, is used for all manner of reasoning, some of them really not very compelling. Some of you have been following the rather disturbing trend to use Wright's language to justify really imperial interventions by powerful governments. And this is a very disturbing trend in the use of Wright's language. I'm not going to talk about that today. I want to talk about an experience I've had, a surprise that I encountered in getting involved in human rights. I mean, I've been involved in human rights since the time I was a student here, and many of the students here, even more, in fact, than 20 years ago. It's been that long? Yeah, it has. Even more are involved in human rights work than was true previously. But later on, when I started writing about the rights frameworks, I had to do research. As I said earlier, I read to write. And I started doing a lot of reading about rights in order to finish things that I was writing. And I found that there was a deep division within the human rights world. And there were these lines drawn very sharply in the sand. And let me just put this a little bit schematically. On the one hand were civil and political rights, and on the other were social and economic rights. And again, I had no clue. I sort of knew what those were, but I had no clue that it was this hotly contested arena. Now, I wasn't surprised, of course, that people in Haiti and Rwanda and Guatemala and Peru and Roxbury, they tended to talk about social and economic rights. The right to health care, the right to housing, the right, in Haiti, the right to food and clean water. And, I've had long discussions with people about the right to fuel. And they're not talking about gasoline for the car. They're talking about something to cook with because they were hungry, had nothing to eat, and they couldn't find fuel. I was more surprised to learn, however, that mainstream human rights language organizations in the United States and Western Europe had often quite an animus for social and economic rights. That's the part that surprised me. And I would ask why. I would go to friends, because they really are friends, in the human rights movements and say, why would you be opposed to social and economic rights? And I'd sometimes say, well, it's my job to ask questions about the right to health care. And I'm just looking, cover the uninsured as the announcement. And we'll return to that. But I would ask them, they would say, well, they're unrealistic, they're not legislatable, is that a word? They may even difficult to legislate, and they may undermine support for civil and political rights. And I said, well, why? How does that work? Why would pressing for social and economic rights undermine the quest for civil and political rights? I just didn't understand. And let me just give an example from the field. Again, back to ARVs, back to Africa, and I'll return to that in closing. For years, there was much more interest, and I'm talking about the post-ARV years, which started in the mid-90s. For years, there was a lot more interest in whether we, for example, did what's called VCT, voluntary counseling and testing, or pre-test counseling, much more interest in that than whether or not we ever gave treatment to the sick, which to me is just bizarre, and a reflection, again, of this focus on certain civil and political rights, and really, again, a loss of focus on the right to health care. Anyway, the bitterness of the feud surprised me, and there are many reasons for that. One of them is because I'm an American, and it's widely believed in the human rights communities that Americans are hostile to social and economic rights. I didn't learn that until far too late. There are also serious epistemological problems posed by desocialization. Now that's a mouthful of big words. I assume epistemology is our understanding of how we create new knowledge, and desocialization I already described. When you take a social fact and strip it of the social truth that surrounds it. And this is a serious epistemological problem, I would argue, for ethics and rights. Now, there are several kinds of desocialization. I'm not going to... One critique you'd expect from an anthropologist, a critique of desocialized medical ethics, for example. And my teacher and friend, Arthur Kleinman, got in some hot water with colleagues in medical ethics when he published an overview of their field and taking medical ethicists to task for failing to ground philosophical debates in social and cultural analysis. And he can be kind of obstreperous, Arthur can. I'm sorry he's not here today. I would say this even more funnily were he here to defend himself. Let's just say, the Haitians say, Americans would say that he takes no prisoners, and the Haitians say he doesn't eat anything cold. Anyway, so he was writing about, he wasn't focused as I am here on political economy, but on what he terms as local social worlds of people who generate and reflect and respond to ethical constructs. And he writes that medical ethics and human rights concerns must be centered in ethnographically informed evaluations in which local knowledge and local moral processes are made as salient as are the issues in global ethical discourse. But now I'm doing something else here. I'm complaining about something different. Global ethical discourse that does not study history and political economy is just dishonest. It must be dishonest, untrue. So these are two very different critiques of ethical discourse that are complementary, I believe. And Kleinman was seeking to underline the importance to ethics of local moral worlds, which don't figure in most normative or foundational accounts. What underpins my critique, in relief, of course, in addition, of course, to the relief that I feel that Kleinman and other anthropologists have done much of the heavy lifting to raise ethicist awareness of local moral worlds. That was his thing. I'm more worried that these ahistoric, I keep looking at my friend who's a historian and taught me this 20 years ago. Ahistoric, is that how you pronounce it? Foundational accounts of global health equity tell a lie. They tell lies about how our world came to be the way it is. Not on purpose. But let me give an example, again, to make this more palpable and vivid. So history and political economy are now so distant from epidemiology and other ways of measuring health inequalities, for example, that it is possible and indeed encouraged to discuss alcohol addiction among Native Americans without ever discussing genocide. Now, in fact, you would be considered something of a provocateur if you ever linked the history of what really happened to the natives of this continent to the current predicament now with alcohol addiction. Or if you read papers on crack cocaine addiction among African Americans, don't expect a discussion of even racism, much less slavery. So this is how desocialized even our social sciences and epidemiology are. You know, I've been collecting some of this stuff, and I recently came across a piece published in a pediatric journal in 1999 about AIDS in Rwanda. And sure enough, the thing was, it said, this research was conducted from 1988 to 1994. And there is no mention in the entire article about AIDS, mind you, AIDS among children in Rwanda. The word violence, genocide, all gone. It's a medical journal. And it's not until the end, you have to read the acknowledgments, and here's what they say. This article is dedicated to the memory of the mothers, children, and personnel of the project and of the members of the Department of Pediatrics who were murdered in 1994 during the genocide in Rwanda. That's it. Now, if AIDS were unrelated to social inequalities, to violence, prior to that sudden explosive year, I would buy it. But it isn't. It's related to gender inequality and labor practices and the price of coffee in Rwanda and the World Bank's policies and how many arms are being sent in from Egypt and South Africa and Europe to Rwanda. AIDS is related to all that. And desocializing our understanding of these epidemics does no one any good, especially not poor people. Now, I was going to go on and talk about some of the other, these epistemological issues, which I, again, try to do every night. I win lots of friends at cocktail parties when I go off on epistemology. But, I want to talk a little bit about social psychology, actually drawing on work by Dan Wickler, who looks at the debate around personal versus social responsibility for illness, and really, in my view, shows, again, that there's this pull towards desocializing our understanding of these problems. But instead, since I'm running out of time, I want to quote, instead of quoting Dan, I want to quote a 19th century Swedish dramatist, August Strindberg. He wrote, "What is philosophy? A seeking of the truth. Then how can philosophy be the friend of the upper classes?" And these are all question answers. "The upper classes pay the philosopher in order that he may discover only such truths as are expedient in their eyes. But suppose uncomfortable truths should be discovered. They are called lies, and the philosopher gets no pay. What is history? The story of the past presented in a light favorable to the interest of the upper classes. Suppose the light is unfavorable. That is scandalous. What is scandal? Anything offending the upper classes." Now, he's joking, kind of. But social history, the sociology of science, including the sociology of social sciences, and political economy, they always steer us back, in my opinion, to the question of social inequalities, which is why I'm very fortunate to have trained here and actually to have my teachers with me here in the room today, and I'm very glad that I was able to do this as a medical student, to take a doctoral degree in a social science relevant to medicine. I think it tells us a lot. You can learn a lot. And I'm not just talking about anthropology, but all of the resocializing or socializing disciplines. And I was going to talk some more about talking about scandal, about the debate that was played out in the New England Journal of Medicine. And you all know that was a debate notable for considerable acrimony. But I have to say, and have said in print many times, I thought it was a wonderful discussion, drawing an analogy and maybe even a direct comparison. Put it this way: if you're an African non-patient who was offered the chance to be a research subject and understood that different standards of care were being applied to you than were being applied to other, lots of words like Tuskegee would come into mind. And I've seen this before in this country, and I've seen it in Haiti, and I'm sure that I'm going to be seeing it in Africa as well. So that was my attempt to convince you that desocialization is a serious epistemological problem. That's not difficult, but it's also an ethical problem. And I know I didn't spend enough time on the latter part, but it's a basic Enlightenment proposition that many of us in this room will buy that, after all, this is not the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, where we don't believe in truth, only truth claims. We're in the medical school. So it is a basic Enlightenment premise that most of you will agree with. I'm just kidding, to my friends in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. Don't kick me out. Can they fire me like they did Summers? Anyway, we need to understand this in order to address these problems. And then finally, I'm going to close with this question of engagement of rich world universities in poor world research. And again, we've talked a lot about, in the past, in this room and in this medical school, about clinical trials. And are grateful to people in this room like Marcia who have taken on this problem, again, at considerable cost to herself. But let's leave trials aside and just go back to the question of proximity. Now, what about that obligation to do no harm, or, to speak honestly, to stop doing harm? This is a major complaint that I've heard from Haiti and Rwanda and other places. And it's not directed so much to universities as to more powerful institutions in this country, and I'll return to them in a second. In fact, there really is only one institution more powerful than Harvard in this country. That was a sociological joke. Anyway, Thomas Pogge, again, I've quoted him a number of times. He's just been brutally honest and unique. I'm, in fact, hoping to meet him. Dan is going to introduce me to him. But wonderful writing about the fallacy of theories of justice that erase histories of injustice. And I was going to talk more about Rwanda and wanted to recommend a couple of books to you. One is Peter Uven wrote a book, I think in 1999, called Aiding Genocide. And it was really about how the Development Inc. world, the development assistance world, helped lay down this structure that permitted the genocide to proceed smoothly in a way. It was obviously not the intention of those involved in this work, but it's a very chilling book to read. And then you'd say, well, surely it isn't as hard in your line of work. I say humanitarian work. Well, let me read to you from tell you about another Rwanda experience. Now, there were a lot of people who came to Rwanda just before the genocide. Almost no one came during the genocide, which lasted about 100 days. But afterwards, the place was flooded with humanitarians, and actually, the cause of considerable conflict within Rwanda. Of course, if you were a Rwandan survivor and lost a lot of family members, you might think, well, where were you guys, 2 months ago? Which was evidently a very common response to the humanitarians in 1994 and 95. But a lot of people there found it impossible to practice medicine in the midst of all this. And I've had a couple of friends who were there, one of them all through the genocide. We've had him here to speak before. Now, after the cessation of hostilities within the Rwandan borders, the humanitarians who worked in refugee camps in Zaire, what was then Zaire, found it even worse than Rwanda. And many of the camps were not run by the United Nations. They were run by the authors of the genocide, which are genocidaires, is what everybody says in Rwanda. So these genocidaires then proceeded to profit directly from the humanitarian aid that poured into Zaire, into Goma. You guys will remember about 1994 in Goma and the epidemic catastrophes and other catastrophes that happened. But it was not until, I think, 2002, I'm trying to look at the date of this, a woman named Fiona Terry, who works with Médecins Sans Frontières, she was at the camp in Goma. She wrote searingly about the mistakes they made in allowing humanitarian aid to be diverted to genocidaires in the former Rwandan military, which had regrouped in and around the camps. And I quote, "The camps had been used as a base from which the former extremist government, army, and Interahamwe militias," these are the genocide militias, "launched raids on Rwanda to continue the killing that they had started in April 1994. The Rwandan government had warned on several occasions that it would break up the camps if nothing was done to control this threat on its border, but no outside state was willing to send armed forces into this dangerous quagmire. Hence, those responsible for genocide, the greatest crime against humanity, remained living with impunity in camps run by the United Nations, and the very system established to protect the refugees became the source of their peril. The history of the Rwandan refugee camps graphically illustrates the paradox of humanitarian action. It can contradict its fundamental purpose by prolonging the suffering it intends to alleviate. Relief agencies rush to avert immediate disaster among the refugees pouring into Tanzania and Zaire, but inadvertently set the scene for the eventual disaster that one of the camp, and then she describes one of the camp members, that the eventual disaster that eventually followed. Former leaders manipulated the aid system to entrench their control over the refugees and diverted resources to finance their own activities. In short, humanitarian aid intended for the victims strengthened the power of the very people who had caused the tragedy. The consequences were devastating, end quote. Now, this was, of course, the prolongation of the conflict in the Congo, where millions perished, probably. And it was a direct offshoot of the genocide and prolonged again in Zaire through this very mechanism. And sometimes we don't see the cost of these misadventures early on. Amartya Sen, again, in this wonderful new book, was writing about the Irish potato famine. He's noted that during the famine, the worst years of the famine, were the calmest years in Ireland. And they're sending off boats full of produce to Britain. But is it really possible to understand the century of conflict that later ensued without understanding, pointing to grievances registered much earlier? And I'm going to close here quoting Sen again, but talking about Africa, which has been the focus of many of my remarks. The neglect of the plight of Africa today can have a similarly long-run effect on world peace in the future. What the rest of the world, especially the rich countries, did or did not do when at least a quarter of the African population seemed to be threatened with extinction through epidemics involving AIDS, malaria, and other maladies, might not be forgotten for a very long time to come. We have to understand more clearly how poverty, deprivation, and neglect, and the humiliations associated with asymmetry of power relate over long periods of time to a proneness to violence, linked with confrontations that draw on grievances against the top dogs in a world of divided identities. Now, top dogs, and this is where I'd like to close. Not everybody in the university sees him or herself as a top dog. In fact, I'm amazed at how often my colleagues can see themselves as really the victims of structural violence, even though they're tenured professors. I don't really quite get that yet, but anyway, I'm just going to close by arguing that a university like this one enjoys special prestige in the world today. And this is true, of course, to varying degrees. But as first world universities go global, and of course I can't help but think of Harvard's efforts to promote global health, the universities are caught up in a web of meaning, and let's just say our reputation precedes us. We're part of the rich world, which is often seen skeptically or with warranted envy in settings in which disease is rampant and life expectancy is falling, but aspirations are not. So much of this asymmetry is linked to growing economic inequality, which is shaped in part by rich world policies that are rarely the focus of critical scrutiny. I'm going to quote James Galbraith again. He said that inequality, global inequality, has been, he called it, a perfect crime. And while statistical forensics can play a small role in pointing this out, no mechanism to reverse this policy exists, still less any that might repair the damage. He makes his prognosis that, as he says, is grim, a descent into apathy, disease, despair, ecological disaster, and wars of separatism and survival in many of the poorest parts of the world. So Galbraith tells us that there's no mechanism to reverse these policies. So how do we pursue, with the best of intentions, work in the poorest parts of the world? Now, I'm going to be a little bit more optimistic than Galbraith. And I think that's because I work here as a physician and get to teach medical students here, but also because I work with Partners in Health, which does precisely that, I hope. But what are some steps for the university? Well, one first step is just to acknowledge the appalling poverty that is the lot of so many. Another is to generate knowledge of use in the world today and make sure that it's shared equitably. I mean, I don't know. I wanted to look up yesterday how much money we received just here at this faculty last year from the NIH, and I think it's close to $1 billion. I think it's $700 million. I mean, we should know. We should be proud of that. But that gives us authority to make some demands on what happens to the fruits of these discoveries. Now, student activism has been much more focused on this issue, I've found, than the activism of scientists, but I have lots of optimism. I met with last Tuesday with my friend Nancy Dosenville and also some students, some undergraduates of mine. I don't know if they're here today. Are you here? No? Anyway, and we met to talk about technology transfer and the role that a university could and should play in making sure to improve access to medicines by fiddling with intellectual property rights and licensing. And they sent me the following information yesterday. In 2001, Médecins Sans Frontières, again, requested a license from Yale University to buy generic stavudine, which is a bedrock of many ARV regimens, from an Indian company that had offered to sell it in South Africa for approximately 3% of the price of the branded version, 3%. Though Bristol Myers Squibb had an exclusive license to sell the drug, Yale was the key patent holder because the drug had been developed at Yale, again with significant public funding. Again, I'm looking at a colleague and friend who has been very brave to write about this. Within 3, I'm not thinking people are going to knock you off or something and put you on a hit list, but I do want you to be okay. Within 3 months of receiving the request from MSF, Yale and BMS, Bristol Myers Squibb, announced that they would permit the sale of generics in South Africa, which has the highest burden of HIV disease in the world, and that the price of brand name stavudine will be slashed 30-fold, from $1,600 per patient per year to $55. And this is for governments and NGOs in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, we're benefiting already, our group is benefiting from these prices, but that's a huge amount of power in the hands of universities. And in contrast, in June 2005, which is not even a year ago, Emory sold its royalty rights to another antiretroviral, to Gilead. Is that how you pronounce it? Gilead. Well, there's no bomb coming from that particular Gilead because they sold it for $525 million. So that drug, unless there are similar licensing agreements, is not going to be available to us in places like Haiti or Rwanda or Lesotho. And we need it because this is probably a better and safer drug than the other drug that I mentioned. It's an important alternative. Now, what the university provides to those seeking to address AIDS and other pandemics, or gender inequality or maternal mortality, name your social pathology. And what we are going to do remains to be seen. A third goal is to teach our students and peers about how the world came to be the way it is. I promised I would end at 5, and I haven't. But let me just say one last thing. I don't think it's merely polemic that Brown University is trying to explore together as a community the relationship of their university to the slave trade. I think that's a good thing. That said, they are not the problem. It's our federal government that is much of the problem here. And the idea that we have no control over a rogue state is not compelling, I'm sure, to any of us. We need to be much more aware of our government's policies abroad. A fourth task for the university would be to link research to service. And I'm not saying that universities should abandon their focus of generating new knowledge. Of course, I don't believe that. But I think a little bit more humanitarian help would be a fine thing for a wealthy university to embrace. These problems are not going to go away. We're going to be faced with disease, hunger, thirst, and violence so long as we venture forth into the world as it is and has long been, and developing new partnerships with other groups with service missions can help universities behave ethically in Africa. That's what Partners in Health tries to do, certainly. Although in some universities there is disdain for all things practical and applied, that could never be the case in a medical school, nor should it be the case in any part of the university. These institutions were founded in the past few centuries and have now grown into islands of privilege and, I hope, decency. Precisely how decent we will prove remains a question. In order to span the rich world, poor world divide ethically, we need to continue to promote the quest for theories and practices of justice that are honest about proximity and causation. And very often, it's less about assisting the distant needy and more about remaking a broken world. Thank you very much, and I look forward to debate.